Every shadow holds a secret. Every seemingly tranquil facade can conceal a terrifying truth. In the annals of American crime, few names evoke as much chilling revulsion as Jeffrey Dahmer. A man who transformed the mundane into the macabre, the human into the horrific. This is not just a recounting of facts. It's an unsettling journey into the genesis of a monster, exploring the subtle shifts, the dark fascinations, and the critical junctures that forged one of history's most notorious serial killers. Our story begins not in a dungeon, but in the seemingly idyllic, unassuming suburbs of Bath, Ohio. Born on the 21st of May, 1960, to Lionel and Joyce Dahmer, Jeffrey's arrival was, by all accounts, a moment of joy for the young couple. Lionel, a diligent research chemist, and Joyce, a passionate, though often emotionally volatile homemaker, had aspirations for their firstborn. Yet, even in infancy, there were whispers of difference. Joyce, in particular, suffered from intense postpartum depression and later confessed to being a heavy user of prescription drugs during her pregnancy, speculating on their potential impact on her son's development. Whether this contributed to Jeffrey's later psychological profile remains a subject of intense debate, but it certainly set a precedent for a household often fraught with tension and emotional instability. As Jeffrey grew, his introverted nature became increasingly pronounced. He was a quiet, almost phantom-like child, rarely engaging in boisterous play typical of boys his age. While other children chased balls and built forts, Jeffrey often retreated into his own world, marked by a peculiar listlessness. His parents recall him being exceptionally shy, struggling to form connections, preferring solitude over camaraderie. Joyce, perhaps overwhelmed by her own struggles, often described Jeffrey as being limp as a baby, lacking the typical infant's vigor. This early assessment, whether accurate or tinged by her own depression, hints at a deeper underlying passivity that would later contrast chillingly with the violence he would inflict. School offered little solace or integration. Jeffrey was an average student, often drifting through classes, described by teachers as intelligent but unmotivated, lacking focus. He displayed no particular academic brilliance, nor any overt behavioral issues that would raise significant red flags. He was simply there, a background character in his own life. His burgeoning interests, however, were anything but ordinary. While other boys might collect comic books or sports cards, Jeffrey's burgeoning fascination was far more macabre. Around the tender age of 10, an unsettling hobby began to consume him. Jeffrey became obsessed with death, specifically the dissection of deceased animals. Roadkill, squirrels, cats, dogs, even birds became his morbid treasures. He would retrieve these lifeless creatures, often from the roadside near his home, and bring them to a small, secluded shed in the backyard. This shed, ordinary to any passerby, was transformed into his secret laboratory of the macabre. Inside this makeshift sanctuary, away from prying eyes, Jeffrey meticulously dismembered the carcasses. He would skin them, study their internal organs, bleach their bones, and sometimes even preserve certain parts in formaldehyde. This wasn't merely a fleeting curiosity. It was an intense, ritualistic pursuit. His father, Lionel, a man of science, sometimes observed Jeffrey's interest, even showing him how to properly clean and preserve bones. He saw it as a potential gateway to a scientific career, never suspecting the dark psychological undercurrents fueling his son's grim hobby. Lionel later expressed profound regret, realizing he had, unknowingly, provided tools and tacit approval for what would become the early training ground for a future serial killer. This shed, filled with a stench of decay and chemicals, was where Jeffrey first learned to manipulate flesh, where his fascination with control over life and death began to fester. It was a terrifying apprenticeship in the shadows. This morbid preoccupation intensified dramatically after the birth of his younger brother, David, in 1966. Jeffrey reportedly felt neglected, displaced in his parents' affections. The emotional turmoil in the household escalated with his mother's increasingly erratic behavior and frequent hospitalizations for psychiatric issues. The parents' relationship became strained, marked by bitter arguments that often erupted into shouting matches. Jeffrey, caught in the crossfire of this domestic discord, retreated further into himself, finding his only sense of agency and control in his macabre experiments. The family unit, once seemingly stable, began to fracture, mirroring the internal fragmentation occurring within young Jeffrey. Adolescence brought new layers of complexity and disturbance. Jeffrey's social awkwardness persisted, bordering on ostracization. He struggled to make friends, often the target of bullies, or simply ignored. His internal world, once dominated by animal dissection, began to shift towards darker, more abstract fantasies. Sexual confusion and nascent homosexual urges began to emerge, tangled with his already established fascination with anatomy and death. These developing desires, rather than finding healthy expression, became inextricably linked to his violent and controlling impulses. He began to fantasize not about connection but about possession, about reducing others to objects under his absolute dominion. Alcohol offered a temporary, destructive escape. By his early teens, Jeffrey was drinking heavily, often alone, using alcohol as a crutch to navigate his crippling social anxiety and the tumultuous landscape of his own mind. He would often arrive at school intoxicated, his grades plummeting, his behavior becoming more erratic, though still largely non-confrontational. His teachers and peers noted his increasing drunkenness, but the underlying psychological distress went unaddressed. This self-medication would become a lifelong pattern, intertwining with and fueling his darker compulsions. The alcohol numbed the pain, but it also dissolved his inhibitions, paving the way for the horrific acts to come. A crucial turning point arrived in 1978, the year he graduated from high school. His parents' marriage had completely disintegrated, culminating in a bitter divorce. Joyce moved to Wisconsin with David, leaving 8-year-old Jeffrey alone in the family home. This newfound freedom, devoid of any parental supervision or structure, proved catastrophic. The dam of his inhibitions, already weakened by alcohol and internal pathologies, burst. The isolated shed of his childhood fantasies was about to be replaced by something far more terrifying: the reality of human victims. His first victim was 8-year-old Steven Hicks. In June of 1978, just weeks after his high school graduation and his parents' departure, Jeffrey picked up Hicks, who was hitchhiking. He brought him back to his empty house, offering him alcohol. What began as a desperate attempt at connection, fueled by loneliness and intoxication, quickly devolved into something monstrous. After Hicks passed out, Dahmer strangled him to death. The act was sudden, unplanned, but it unlocked something terrifying within him. The fantasy of absolute control, nurtured for years in the dissection of animals, was now applied to a human being. The immediate aftermath was a gruesome tableau of panic and perverse curiosity. Jeffrey dismembered Hicks's body in the basement, dissolving the flesh in acid and crushing the bones with a sledgehammer, scattering the remains in the woods behind his house. This horrific act, his first, was a terrifying experiment in depravity, an attempt to erase the evidence and, perhaps, to process the unfathomable reality of what he had done. It was a shocking escalation, a crossing of a Rubicon from which there was no return. The monster, long lurking in the shadows of his mind, had finally emerged into the light, leaving a trail of unspeakable horror in its wake. The boy who dissected animals had now graduated to human prey, and the quiet suburbs would never be truly quiet again.